Scrap iron, duct tape, and spite. That was our entire defense line. When the Kalan Armada warped into the Sol system, their hulls gleamed with pristine dark matter shielding. We met them with rusted mining barges and retrofitted garbage scows leaking coolant. They broadcasted a laugh. We didn't laugh back. Sweat pooled in the collar of Arthur Hayes' stained jumpsuit, smelling sharply of old onions and cheap synthetic fabric. He wiped his palms on his thighs, leaving streaks of black grease against the grey cotton. Beneath his boots, the deck plates of the Iron Lung, officially registered as a deep space slag hauler, vibrated with an erratic, teeth-rattling hum. It was the sound of a Class 4 industrial reactor trying to process weapons-grade plasma, a task it was never designed for. Arthur's throat felt like sandpaper. He stared at the primary tactical monitor. The screen was cracked in the bottom left corner, held together by a strip of clear adhesive tape that had yellowed with age. Space outside the scratched armorglade of the bridge viewport wasn't an empty void. It was cluttered with junk. 300 human vessels floated in loose formation above the orbit of Mars. None of them matched. To Arthur's left drifted a massive orbital refinery, its processing stacks hastily capped and loaded with magnetic mass drivers. Below them, a swarm of deep space salvage tugs hummed in the dark, strapped with stolen kinetic shielding and surplus railguns welded directly to their towing hardpoints. They looked like floating trash. Because they were. Earth didn't have a military armada. The Galactic Council had seen to that 70 years ago, imposing strict sanctions on human ship production. We were allowed haulers, miners, and atmospheric shuttles. Nothing with a spinal mount. Nothing with military-grade warp capabilities. We were supposed to be harmless, a compliant species of labourers digging up helium-3 and rare earth metals for the core worlds. "Reactor temp is climbing, Artie," a voice rasped over the internal comms. It was Miller down in engineering. The audio feed crackled with static accompanied by the rhythmic, heavy thud of a busted intake valve. If we push the drive any harder, the containment field is going to melt and vaporize us before the aliens even get a shot off. "Keep venting the excess heat into the cargo bays," Arthur replied, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of adrenaline and unwashed teeth. "Just keep the main capacitor fed. We only need it to hold together for one punch." "Copy that. Venting." Arthur leaned back into his command chair. It was a repurposed tractor seat bolted to the floorboards. His hands shook. He wasn't a soldier. He was a 50-year-old mechanic with a bad back, 2 alimony payments, and a persistent cough from breathing in pulverized silicon for 3 decades. He didn't want to be here. None of them did. But the Council had decided humanity was becoming a liability. The eviction notice had arrived 2 days ago, delivered in the form of a heavily armed fleet dropping out of hyperspace just beyond Jupiter. A high-pitched chime echoed through the cramped bridge. "Proximity alert," muttered O'Brien, the ship's navigator. O'Brien was a kid, barely 22, his face pale and slick with terror. He was aggressively chewing a thumbnail, his eyes locked on the radar sweep. "They're moving into firing range. Council fleet." Arthur leaned forward. Through the viewport, the stars began to blur. Then, space tore open. The Kalan Armada arrived in a cascade of blinding violet light. 50 dreadnoughts, perfectly geometric, polished to a mirror shine. They were elegant, terrifying things shaped like sharpened daggers, glowing with the soft blue hue of superior energy shielding. They didn't have external thrusters or exposed exhaust ports. They looked like gods of war gliding silently through the vacuum. Next to them, the human fleet looked like a collection of battered tin cans strung together with wire. A new frequency overrode the bridge's comm system. It wasn't a standard hail. It was a broadband broadcast pumped through every speaker in the human fleet with crystal-clear, horrifying fidelity. "Unsanctioned human vessels," a voice echoed. It was smooth, synthetic, and dripping with condescension. "This is Fleet Commander Tail of the Galactic Council. You are in violation of Treaty Code 7 Alpha. We note your—" The voice paused. A low clicking sound followed. It took Arthur a second to realize the alien was laughing. "We note your attempt at militarization. Disband this scrap fleet immediately and surrender your planet for atmospheric processing, or you will be exterminated. Arthur felt his stomach twist. He looked down at his console, the rusted metal, the blinking analog lights, the smell of burnt copper and stale coffee. It was pathetic. They were pathetic. "Artie," O'Brien whispered, his voice trembling. "What do we do?" Arthur squeezed his eyes shut. He thought about the asteroid belts. He thought about the pressure blasts, the cave-ins, the sheer, unadulterated violence of tearing rocks apart in zero gravity. The aliens thought they were facing a military. They weren't. They were facing miners. "Open a channel," Arthur said. His voice was suddenly very quiet. O'Brien blinked, his hand hesitating over the comms board. To the whole fleet?" "Yeah, whole fleet." Arthur grabbed the heavy brass microphone dangling from the ceiling wire. It was greasy to the touch. He pressed the activation stud. "This is the iron lung to all vessels," Arthur said, staring at the polished, gleaming daggers in the distance. "They think we're a joke. Let's show them how we break rocks." He let go of the button. The silence on the bridge was deafening, broken only by the rattle of the deck plates. "Full burn," Arthur ordered. "Drive us right down their throats." Alarms screamed in discordant pitches. The bridge of the iron lung plunged into a deep bloody red as the tactical monitors flared. The Kalan Armada didn't wait. They fired. Dozens of coherent light beams, thick as redwood trunks and blindingly white, lanced silently across the blackness of space. Arthur braced himself, grabbing the armrests of his tractor seat so hard his knuckles popped. "Impact in 3, O'Brien yelled, curling into a tight ball over his console. 2, 1. The hit didn't sound like an explosion. It felt like a physical punch to the chest. The iron lung lurched violently to starboard. A shower of sparks rained down from the ceiling conduit, smelling of melting plastic and ozone. Arthur's teeth clattered together, biting the inside of his cheek. Warm blood pooled in his mouth. "Shields are gone!" O'Brien shrieked, coughing through a sudden haze of grey smoke venting from the floor grates. "Hull breach in Sector 4! They're burning through the armour! Divert power from life support to the portside magnetic grapples!" Arthur spat a mouthful of blood onto the deck. "Miller, how's the hull holding?" "No, it's a metre of solid tungsten and compacted slag," Miller roared over the comms, coughing violently. "They're melting it, but we ain't a fragile military scout. We're built to take micrometeorite impacts at high velocity. She's holding, barely." The Council had made a fatal miscalculation. They were used to fighting other warships, sleek aerodynamic vessels built around energy shields and lightweight composite alloys designed for speed. When their lasers hit a military ship, the shield overloaded, and the thin hull popped like a balloon. Human mining barges didn't rely on energy shields. They relied on sheer, stupid mass. The iron lung had armour plating salvaged from dead asteroids, welded in thick, ugly layers. The alien lasers were gouging deep, molten craters into the ship's sides, but they weren't punching through. Through the viewport, Arthur watched the human fleet accelerate. They weren't flying in formation. They were charging like a rabid, disorganized mob. A pristine Kalan dreadnought drifted right into the path of the Chicago, a massive, blocky helium tanker. The alien ship fired a barrage of plasma torpedoes, turning the front of the tanker into a raging inferno. But the Chicago didn't stop. It rammed straight through the fire, its momentum completely unchecked. The impact was catastrophic. The tanker slammed into the dreadnought's elegant flank. The alien's dark matter shielding flared violently and collapsed under the immense kinetic force. Metal shrieked, a sound that translated even through the vacuum via the ship's integrated sensors, as the tanker's heavy reinforced bow simply crushed the sleek alien vessel in half. Arthur felt a wild, unhinged grin spread across his bloody teeth. "O'Brien, target that cruiser on our left! Spool up the main drill!" "Drill spooled," O'Brien yelled, his fear suddenly giving way to a frantic manic energy. The iron lung wasn't armed with lasers or missiles. It was armed with an industrial plasma cutter meant to crack open planetary crusts. "Fire the grapples!" Arthur shouted. Beneath them, heavy pneumatic cannons hammered. 4 massive tungsten spikes trailing thick cables of braided durasteel shot across the void. 2 missed. 2 slammed directly into the hull of the Kaelan cruiser, embedding themselves deep into the alien metal. The Kaelan ship tried to pull away, its elegant blue thrusters flaring, but it was tethered to 40,000 tons of Earth's finest scrap metal. The cables pulled taut, jerking the iron lungs so hard Arthur was nearly thrown from his seat. "Reel them in!" Arthur barked, his hands flying across his manual overrides, bypassing failing safety protocols. The winches screamed, groaning under the strain. The pristine alien cruiser was dragged sideways, completely losing its maneuverability. Through the viewport it grew larger and larger, its weapons batteries desperately firing into the iron lung's reinforced bow, melting slag but failing to hit anything vital. "Range is optimal," O'Brien yelled, wiping sweat and soot from his eyes. "Light the torch," Arthur said. From the front of the iron lung, a beam of superheated industrial plasma erupted. It wasn't a quick, clean pulse. It was a sustained, roaring pillar of raw thermal energy, messy and bright orange, spewing molten blowback in all directions. The beam hit the Kaelan cruiser dead center. Alien energy shields were designed to deflect rapid-fire kinetic slugs and dissipate momentary laser blasts. They had no idea how to handle a sustained thermal bore meant to melt solid granite. The shield held for 3 seconds, then it shattered like glass. The plasma cutter dug into the pristine polished hull of the cruiser. Metal boiled instantly. Arthur watched as the cutting beam sliced sideways, dragging a jagged molten scar across the enemy ship. Internal atmosphere vented violently into space, freezing instantly into clouds of sparkling ice crystals. Secondary explosions rippled along the cruiser's spine as the cutter ignited their power conduits. With a silent, blinding flash, the Kaelan ship tore itself apart, raining burning debris against the iron lung's viewport. Arthur exhaled, a long, shaky breath. The bridge was sweltering, filled with the stench of burning insulation and raw sweat. His hands were shaking so hard he had to tuck them under his armpits. He looked at the tactical map. The Council Armada's perfect geometric formation was gone. They were scattering, completely entirely unprepared for a close-quarters brawl with enemies who didn't care about sophisticated tactics. All around them, the junk fleet was going to work. Industrial grinders were chewing through pristine hulls. Salvage drones were ripping weapons turrets right off their mounts. The void of space was filling with the wreckage of untouchable gods, broken by men and women with dirt under their fingernails. "Artie," Miller's voice came through the comms, laced with breathless disbelief. They're falling back. The dreadnoughts are breaking formation." Arthur grabbed the greasy microphone, wiping a smear of blood off his chin. "Don't let up. They wanted a fight in the dirt. Show them how deep we can dig." Panic has a specific smell. It's a sour, chemical odor that seeps out of a person's pores when their brain realizes the body's about to die. The bridge of the iron lung reeked of it. It mingled with the stench of scorched wiring and the copper tang of the blood Arthur was still casually spitting into a dirty rag. The initial shock and awe of the human charge had broken the Kaelan Armada's vanguard. We had surprised them with our sheer, suicidal stupidity. But the Kaelan were a military force, and military forces adapt. "They're burning hard on a reverse vector." O'Brien's voice was an octave too high, his fingers slipping on the greasy keys of his navigation console. The kid looked like a ghost wrapped in a filthy jumpsuit. "They're pulling back, Artie, opening the gap." Arthur leaned into the cracked glass of his tactical monitor. The polished, dagger-like alien dreadnoughts were retreating, their blue thrusters flaring as they reorganized into a tight defensive hemisphere. They had realized that letting garbage scows get within grappling range was a death sentence. They were putting distance between themselves and the junk fleet, preparing to use their superior range to pick the humans apart. "Incoming fire," O'Brien whispered. It wasn't a coordinated volley this time. It was a torrential downpour of coherent light. The void flashed blinding white as long-range plasma lances and heavy particle beams slammed into the disorganized human swarm. To Arthur's right, a repurposed garbage hauler named the Stink Bug took a direct hit to its unarmored underbelly. The kinetic force didn't just breach the hull, it snapped the ship's spine. A silent, blooming fireball of ignited methane and oxygen swallowed the vessel, leaving nothing but spinning blackened debris. "Miller!" Arthur keyed the comms, his voice sounding entirely too calm for a man whose heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Give me a damage readout. What's falling off my ship?" "What isn't falling off, Artie?" Miller screamed over the deafening whine of the overloaded reactor. "We're bleeding atmosphere in 3 decks. The portside stabilizers are fused, and the containment field is screaming." Arthur glanced at his secondary display. The numbers were grim. System. Status integrity. Immediate threat, primary armor, tungsten/slag. Compromised 42% thermal melting on starboard bow. Industrial plasma cutter, functional 88%. Feed lines overheating. Magnetic grapples jammed. Port, 50% winch motors blown. Life support rerouted, 15% asphyxiation in 14 minutes. They were dying. The whole fleet was dying. The Kalen long-range barrage was a meat grinder, and the human ships, for all their thick armor, were just meat. "Artie, they're targeting the heavy lifters," O'Brien yelled, pointing at the radar sweep. "The Chicago just lost its main drive. They're dead in the water. We can't close the distance. They're just going to kite us until we're all ash." Arthur wiped a hand down his face, smearing grease across his nose. His back ached with a dull, throbbing intensity that demanded painkillers he didn't have. He looked at the pristine alien ships, hovering out of reach, safely executing their sterile mathematical warfare. He hated them. He hated their clean lines, their perfect shields, their arrogant assumption that a fight was something you did from a distance with clean hands. "O'Brien," Arthur grunted, gripping the heavy iron armrests of his chair. "You still have control of the cargo bay doors?" "Yeah. Why?" "And the external coolant vents?" "Artie, if we vent the coolant, the reactor melts down in 5 minutes. If we don't, we're dead in 2. Arthur slammed his palm onto the manual override panel. "Open the cargo bays, all of them. Dump the payload." O'Brien stared at him, horrified, but his hands moved. The iron lung was a slag hauler. Its massive internal bays were filled with 50,000 tons of pulverized rock, heavy metals, and hyperdense asteroid dust meant for orbital processing. With a deep, groaning shudder that vibrated through the soles of Arthur's boots, the massive underside doors of the ship yawned open. In the zero-gravity vacuum, the slag didn't fall. It drifted out in a massive, expanding cloud of jagged debris and microscopic dust. "Now the coolant," Arthur barked. "Blow the main line straight into the debris field." A violent hiss shook the ship. Highly pressurized, super-chilled liquid nitrogen and synthetic coolant blasted out of the external vents, colliding with the expanding cloud of pulverized rock. The liquid flashed instantly into a dense, freezing fog, binding with the dust to create a massive, opaque nebula of ice and slag. "Broadcast to the fleet on an open channel," Arthur ordered, his voice raw. "Tell them to dump their holds and vent their coolant. Blow it all. Create a wall." Across the battlefield, the junk fleet complied. Heavy freighters, mining barges, and garbage scows opened their bellies. They vomited millions of tons of dust, ice, scrap metal, and raw ore into the void. Within seconds, a massive, impenetrable curtain of absolute filth blossomed between the human ships and the Kalen Armada. The alien lasers fired, but coherent light requires a clear path. When the heavy particle beams hit the dense cloud of ice, dust, and reflective metals, the beams scattered. The energy refracted, diffused, and dissipated, turning the deadly lances into harmless glowing auroras within the dirt cloud. "Radar is blind, Artie," O'Brien shouted over the chaotic alarms. "The dust is scrambling our sensors." "It's scrambling theirs too," Arthur growled, a feral, exhausting smile touching his cracked lips. "They rely on perfect targeting telemetry. We rely on hitting things with hammers. Hard to target what you can't see." He grabbed the overhead throttle, a heavy mechanical lever wrapped in friction tape. "Divert all remaining life support power to the main drive," Arthur commanded. The bridge lights flickered and died, plunging them into the dim red glow of emergency battery backups. The air immediately began to grow stale and freezing cold. "Take us into the dirt, kid. Full blind burn." The iron lung plunged into the abrasive, swirling cloud of its own making. Micro-impacts hammered against the hull like a billion tiny drum beats, a deafening, terrifying roar of static and scraping metal. They were flying blind, suffocating in a dying ship, charging into the dark. The interior of the dust cloud was a sensory nightmare. The bridge shook so violently that Arthur bit his tongue, filling his mouth with fresh, hot blood. Outside the viewport there was nothing but a chaotic swirl of grey dust and flashing, refracted blue light from deflected alien lasers. "I can't see them," O'Brien screamed, his hands gripping the edges of his console to keep from being thrown out of his seat. "Proximity alarms are going crazy. We're going to ram one of our own ships." "Hold your vector," Arthur roared back, spitting a glob of blood onto the steel deck. "They're big. We'll find them." They burst through the far side of the debris cloud like a breaching whale. The Kalen Armada was right there. They had pushed forward, trying to scan through the interference, totally unprepared for the human ships to blind jump through an asteroid field of their own making. The iron lung emerged less than a kilometre from the largest ship in the alien fleet. A colossal, spear-shaped dreadnought covered in glowing golden command markings. The flagship. The bridge comms shrieked, an override frequency forcing its way through the static. "Cease your advance!" The synthetic voice of Commander Tile was no longer smooth. It was clipped, frantic, vibrating with genuine alien panic. "This maneuver is mathematically suicidal. You're destroying your own vessels. Cease instantly, or—" Arthur reached up and violently ripped the comms wire out of the ceiling console. The bridge fell mercifully silent save for the screaming reactor alarms. "Target the flagship," Arthur barked, his throat tearing with the effort. "Grapples are jammed! We can't tether them," O'Brien yelled, tears of sheer terror cutting clean tracks through the soot on his cheeks. "I didn't say tether them, I said target them." Arthur unbuckled himself from his tractor seat. He stumbled forward, his bad knee screaming in protest, and grabbed the manual helm controls. The metal of the yoke was freezing cold. "Miller, how much juice in the plasma cutter?" "None. The feed lines are melted as slag. We got nothing left, Artie. Reactor is hitting critical mass in 60 seconds. We're dead." "Not yet." Arthur gripped the yoke. The massive dreadnought filled the viewport, its elegant, perfect hull pristine and untouchable. Its point defense turret swiveled, tracking the battered, burning mining barge hurtling toward it. "O'Brien," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a calm, deadened whisper. "Reroute the inertial dampeners, all of them. Dump them into the forward deflector shields." O'Brien froze. "Artie, if we drop the dampeners and hit something, the kinetic shockwave will turn our organs to jelly." "Do it, kid." O'Brien swallowed hard. He punched the commands. The heavy, comforting hum of the artificial gravity and inertial dampeners died. Arthur felt his stomach float, a nauseating wave of weightlessness hitting him just as the iron lung accelerated. "Brace!" Arthur roared. He didn't fire a weapon, he didn't deploy a grapple, he just drove the ship. The iron lung, 50,000 tons of hardened tungsten, compacted slag, and industrial stubbornness, travelling at a significant fraction of orbital velocity, slammed headfirst into the centre of the Kalen flagship. The sound was beyond human comprehension. It wasn't a crash. It was the end of the world. Arthur's vision went entirely white. A physical wall of kinetic energy punched through the bridge. The reinforced armor-glass viewport shattered inward in a million jagged pieces. The deck plates buckled, folding upward like crushed cardboard. Arthur was thrown backward, his shoulder slamming into the steel bulkhead with a sickening crunch. Ribs snapped. His breath left his lungs in a violent rush, and the taste of copper was instantly replaced by the taste of ash. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, there was just the violent, tearing shriek of metal being completely annihilated. Then, Silence. The heavy, ringing silence of the void. Arthur lay on the slanted, broken deck. The emergency lights were entirely gone. The only illumination came from the sparking ruin of the navigation console and the raging electrical fires burning outside the shattered viewport. He blinked, trying to clear the blood from his left eye. He couldn't feel his right arm. Every breath was a jagged knife in his chest. "O'Brien?" Arthur croaked, coughing violently. A groan answered him from the dark. "Yeah," a weak, trembling voice came from beneath a pile of collapsed ceiling tiles. "Yeah, I'm here." Arthur dragged himself up with his good arm. He leaned against the twisted remains of his command chair, looking out through the hole where the viewport used to be. The Kalen flagship was gone. The iron lung had hit it with such immense, unchecked kinetic force that the sleek, elegant dreadnought had simply snapped in half. The pristine dark matter shielding had overloaded instantly, and the alien hull, designed to deflect energy, had crumpled like foil under the weight of a flying anvil. The two halves of the flagship were drifting apart in the vacuum, spilling glittering alien atmosphere and the shattered wreckage of their perfect technology into the dark. Arthur watched a beautifully polished golden command turret drift slowly past the open hole of his bridge, completely severed from its power source. Around them, the battle was ending. The destruction of the flagship was the breaking point. The remaining Kalen dreadnoughts, horrified by the barbaric suicidal insanity of the human tactics, were breaking off. Their blue thrusters flared as they turned their backs on Earth, initiating emergency warp jumps to escape the debris field. They were running. The untouchable gods were fleeing from a bunch of bruised, bleeding mechanics throwing rocks. Arthur coughed again, wiping a thick smear of blood from his nose. The air was getting thin. The cold of space was creeping into the shattered bridge, freezing the sweat on his forehead. "RT?" Miller's voice crackled through a handheld emergency radio pinned under some debris. The signal was weak, barely audible over the hiss of escaping oxygen. "Reactor. Reactor is stabilized. We vented the core into their hull when we hit them. We're floating." "Good work, Miller," Arthur rasped, his throat sounding like tearing paper. He looked down at his ruined hands. They were covered in grease, dirt, and his own blood. He looked out at the floating wreckage of the most powerful military armada in the galaxy, utterly dismantled by garbage scows and mining lasers. There was no grand sense of victory. No heroic music swelled in the background. Arthur just felt tired. His back hurt, his shoulder was definitely dislocated, and he really, really wanted a cup of terrible cheap coffee. "O'Brien," Arthur muttered, sliding down the bulkhead to sit on the cold tilted floor. "Yeah, Artie." "Send a tight beam burst to the Council homeworld." Arthur let his head loll back against the steel, staring up at the sparking wires dangling from the ceiling. "What do you want it to say?" Arthur closed his eyes, listening to the agonizing groans of the cooling metal around him. He thought about the pristine ships, the clean hands, the arrogant laughter that had echoed over the comms just an hour ago. "Tell them," Arthur breathed, his chest rattling, "to stay out of our junkyard. If you enjoyed this gritty tale of humanity's unrelenting, stubborn willpower, make sure to smash that like button and share it with your fellow sci-fi fans. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more Golden Age HFY stories where humans prove that a little duct tape and a lot of spite can conquer the galaxy. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload, and drop a comment below on what you thought of Arthur's final stand.